Few bonds are as profound as the companionship between humans and their animals. The unconditional love in a dog's wagging tail, the comforting purr of a cat curled up on your lap, or the gentle nudge of a horse against your neck. These moments of connection filled with silent understanding and mutual trust. Not all human and animal relationships, however, are just for companionship. There is something quintessentially Australian when you picture a farmer rounding up his flock with the help of a tireless sheepdog, their movements and understanding in perfect harmony under the vast open sky. A stockman and their loyal horse spending days or weeks together moving cattle, each step a testament to centuries of shared toil and trust. These partnerships are woven with threads of dedication and unspoken understanding, whether it's a search and rescue dog braving the elements to find a lost soul, or a therapy animal bringing comfort and healing to those in need. Animals become indispensable partners in our endeavours. They bring their unique instincts, unwavering loyalty, and boundless energy, transforming challenges into triumphs. This working relationship is not merely functional, it's a profound connection built on trust and shared purpose. Animals teach us patience, perseverance, and the value of hard work. They remind us that success is sweeter when achieved together, and that the bond between species can create incredible outcomes. In farms, fields, and forests, this collaboration illuminates the extraordinary potential of human and animal partnerships. It's a relationship that celebrates the best of both worlds, forging paths of achievement and deep abiding friendship. Today we are heading to Eden on the New South Wales South Coast to explore one of the most unlikely yet collaborative and mutually rewarding relationships between humans and a wild and widely regarded formidable companion, the killer whale. Welcome to If These Trees Could Talk. The team at If These Trees Could Talk wish to acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional lands of the Wonnarua Nation. We would like to recognise that we are sharing our stories from the stolen lands of our nation's first storytellers. Our conversations in many ways follows their traditions of storytelling and sharing knowledge and experience. We wish to pay our respect to the Wonnarua elders and ancestors, as well as extend that respect to all First Nations people, including our listeners, and acknowledge and honour their continued connection to the land and waters that have been the inspiration for the stories we share.
We would like to acknowledge all lands that this podcast is being broadcast on, in particular the Yuin Nation, where this story takes place today.
I came away with this intense desire to know as much as I possibly could about this animal. Whales died. There was uproar. How does it make me feel? I'm clearly Team Orca.
Do we need a disclaimer today for sensitive information, Shannon?
No, I'm not going to traumatise you 2 weeks in a row, I promise. People won't come back, Megan. Today, we're going to do something that I'm really excited about. It's got whales, which are my favourite.
You love whales. You're very good at spotting them.
I am very good at spotting them. I do also really like rubbing it in to your dad when we find them.
One of my favourite memories was spending a good 5 hours sitting on the top of Newcastle Harbour spotting whale after whale after whale while you shared very deep, sensitive stories with me. Great memory.
Oh, yeah, that was great. Today, I am going to take you to Eden, which is a little coastal town nestled on the south coast of New South Wales. It is renowned for its stunning natural beauty and rich maritime history. Perched on Twofold Bay, this charming town sits on the hills that gently slope down to the pristine beaches and crystal clear waters that surround it. Twofold Bay is the third deepest natural harbour in the Southern Hemisphere, a mecca for fishing, whale watching and diving. The bay covers an area of over 30 square kilometres. Biwa National Park, formerly Ben Boyd National Park, fringes the southern edge of the bay and is a thoroughly fascinating area to explore with rich history. During spring, humpback whales often come right into the bay to feed and nurse their young on their long journey south to Antarctica. Twofold Bay is famous for its intriguing whale history and the famous Killers of Eden. If you're visiting the area and get anything from today's story, I highly recommend the self-drive Killer Whale Trail, which visits intriguing historical sites in Eden and Biwa National Park. I've been to Eden a couple of times, and I know Megan has too because I raved to her about it, and then she sent me a picture from
I was so proud.
the Biwa National Park sign. We have recorded a previous episode, but it's a bit dark too. So we thought we might just bring in the light one about this national park before we go back and revisit the tales of Benjamin Boyd. So our first visit to Eden was on our way home from our first Tasmania trip. So 8 years ago, we went again last September, and the whale spotting was spectacular from the whole way down the coast. But we did a whale cruise at Bermagui, and then we spent an entire day in Biwa National Park just going from headland to headland watching whales, and we could hear them. Like, they were so close to the shore, we could hear them. It was absolutely incredible. We did drop into the museum, and probably like a lot of other people, and I know one particular person who I will talk about a little later in this story, I went into that museum and then wanted to devour every single bit of information I possibly could about Davidson's Whale Station and this story of the orcas in that area.
Your kids must love you.
No, they don't.
I remember having to go to museums with my parents. I hated it. I love it now.
When we went to Tasmania, the big kids were like, "This is so shit." Walking around Port Arthur and old jails and stuff, and I thought, oh, the kids are going to be so into this, and it was so beautiful looking out, beautiful green grass and stuff, and they just complained the whole way.
Are you going to make them to listen to every episode of your podcast?
No, I'm not. But one day when they get old like me, they'll probably really enjoy this podcast. It's the beautiful river saga. Look at the beautiful river.
So my dad used to say to me, and we rolled our eyes every time we went over this bridge. Oh, it's a beautiful river, and we'd roll our eyes, and now I go over the river and go, oh,
it's
really?
So beautiful.
It's really beautiful.
Scott does it every single time. So for context, Megan is my sister-in-law. So when we talk about each other's family members and stuff, we are, we're not just making random assumptions about the people in our lives. My partner is Megan's brother.
Before we get too deep into this story, and I apologise if you have planned to do this, but from my own knowledge, I need to know the difference between orcas, killer whales, dolphins. What is an orca?
An orca and a killer whale is the exact same thing, and they are the largest in the dolphin species.
Not a whale. You can see why I'm confused.
Yes.
Do you know why they're called killer whales?
Because of the way they hunt. Have you ever watched National Geographic or the Discovery Channel? Oh, they're wild. They are wild. They really, really like playing with their prey.
Oh, lovely.
It's quite disturbing to watch. I love them. I just love them so much, and it's my next thing. Seeing a humpback whale was my thing for such a long time. The first time that I did it, I got such a natural high. I think it was 2 weeks. I was buzzing for 2 weeks. It's the most incredible feeling to be up close to one of these animals. I would love to see an orca in the wild. Very recently, a fisherman spotted one just out of the Heads at Swansea. It's possible. You've just got to be out there on the water to be able to do it. I I don't think I'll be heading to Antarctica anytime soon. So it's probably going to be one of those long-term goals, like not an immediate one that I'm just going to be able to tick off. So
if anyone can do it, you can.
this one might be a little bit harder. Yes, if you watch them hunt, it looks brutal. It would almost appear like they are playing with their food or torturing it, depending on how you look at it. I've read a few books since going on this trip and becoming obsessed with orcas, and a lot of those characteristics of them, like say when they catch a seal and they flip it up in the air and they throw it around a little bit like it's a beach ball, and a lot of that is about teaching the juveniles how to hunt. So they will be throwing it, but they will be expecting the juvenile then to catch it. So the animal that they're hunting will be mildly stunned. They do the same thing with sharks. So they will flip a shark onto its back, either with their tail or their nose. They're great. Like they are an apex predator. And they will flip a shark onto their back, and it almost like puts it into a catatonic state. And then that will give the young orcas a chance to, get their chompers into it and stuff. So I think this is where the term killer whale has come from.
And you want to see one?
In the wild, yes. In New Zealand quite often, and a lot of places around Canada, people will be paddleboarding and they'll like come up next to the paddleboards and stuff. They're not known for hurting humans in the wild. Like humans aren't on their menu.
I assume that a paddleboard to something under the water could look like a seal though.
It could, and there has been a case of one man being bitten, but again, it was a case, they believe scientifically it was a case of mistaken identity. But I will go into a little bit more of that stuff later. So the part that we're going to look into is the Davidson whaling station, which is right on the shores of Twofold Bay. I'll go into a lot of the facts, but we'll do a little bit of the history and then we'll move into the really cool part of the story.
Let's do this.
Okay. Alexander Walker Davidson and Jane Simpson, his wife, left Dundee in Scotland on the 16th of May 1841 and arrived at Port Jackson on the 30th of January 1842. They had travelled on the Mathesis. A fire broke out on the ship during their travels and it had to be docked and repaired in Rio de Janeiro. I did hear a bit of a random tale about there was a heap of soap or something on board, and in the fire it melted and that's what kept the ship together, so they all didn't die at sea. But I haven't got any hardcore facts on that. It was just something I heard somewhere and I can't remember where. So they travelled with their children, Margaret Helen Davidson, Elsie Adams Davidson, Jane Davidson, Alexander Davidson, and I'm using their last name because some of them have got middle names that sound like last names, so we don't get the genealogy all mixed up. Alexander Davidson, Archer Boswell Christie Davidson, Isabella Colley Davidson, but Isabella died en route and was buried at sea. She was the youngest of their children, which was fairly standard for the time, but still makes me a little bit sad. So they arrived in 1842 in Sydney, and their son, George Dunbar Davidson, was born. Alexander and his wife Jane and the children lived in Millers Point, Sydney for about a year while Alexander worked as a carpenter around the area known today as the Rocks and Circular Quay. Alexander then took up employment with Ben Boyd at Boyd Town, where he worked as a cabinet maker, a trade which he was particularly skillful. Alexander built a cottage on the Kaya Inlet and lived there for some time with his family. Boyd Town didn't last forever, so the people who worked there, Benjamin Boyd wasn't super skilled at longevity. And we know a little bit about this because we've recorded a previous episode on it, which will come out after this one. So if you would like some information about that, you can look up Benjamin Boyd Beerwah National Park, which will have some additional information about this area. Alexander tried his hand at a few things after he finished working for Benjamin Boyd. He purchased a hotel, which he ran for a little while, but the gold rush started and he had a couple of cracks at gold mining without real success. The longest time spent in Kiandra with his 3 eldest sons, while the girls and George stayed behind while they were off trying to get rich. But it didn't work. So back in Kaya, Alexander purchased several whale boats from John Barclay and turned his focus more to whaling. This was to become a new way of life for the Davidson family. The Davidsons had a good relationship with the local Aboriginal people, employed many in their whaling activities. Before the development of the petroleum industry, whale oil was a major source of illumination, lubrication and soap manufacturing and helped drive the Industrial Revolution. The baleen, which is the little filter things that are humpback whales or blue whales that you see that they filter the krill through. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Shannon's pointing to her teeth.
It's like a little furry thing that hangs down. So anyway, the baleen was used to manufacture the bones in women's corsets.
Wow.
Yep. And as well as eyeglasses and fishing rod tips. So they used it in a way similar to the way that we would use plastic now, which is really hard because when you look at it, like it almost looks like hair, like really thick fibrous hair. And I don't know what they do to it to make it become like bones in a corset. It'd be some melting strategy, I suppose. But yeah, that's how when they say whale bone corsets, that's where it comes from, the little... And I'm doing the thing again. the little furry teeth stuff.
Or whiskers. It could be whiskers.
It's inside their mouth.
I know. I'm just looking at what your hands are doing.
It's like an internal beard.
That's a good simile.
Yeah.
I can see it now.
Yeah. At the height of the whaling industry in Eden, 30 boats operated out of the port. The town is famous for its whaling history, in particular the remarkable pod of killer whales that assisted the whalers of the Davidson Whaling Station. There are so many incredible tales, mostly revolving around Alexander's youngest son George and his crew's relationship with the orcas. The friendship between man and killer whale began with the local Yuin people who revered the orcas as the reincarnated spirits of their ancestors. The killers would regularly herd passing whales into the bay, and as a result, many whales became stranded, providing a welcome feast for the people, as well as whale oil, which they also used. The Yuin people would revere this as a gift from their ancestors. Their relationship was with the orcas, which is what they named Biawa, and that is what the national park was renamed when Benjamin Boyd's name was taken off it. And they renamed it Biawa National Park. So that is the name for orcas. It was the relationship between the Yuin people who believed that their ancestors became orcas. And so then when the orcas would push the humpback whales into the shallow water, they believed it was a gift from their ancestors. Before we go on to the Davidsons, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the orcas and what we mentioned before. So the threat to humans, i.e. they're called killer whales and they have really big chompers. But as history would show, there is not a lot of instances of people being harmed or killed by orcas. So in 1910, orcas attempted to flip ice with humans and sled dogs during an expedition, but I don't know if those people died because they were tipped into the water, but they weren't eaten as far as we know. But again, it was 1910. In the 1950s, an Inuit man was potentially killed by an orca who was trapped in the ice, and the orca couldn't get out, like it had frozen around, and he smashed the ice, and the Inuit man went in and the orca ate him. So we know that one, again, 1950s. There's no photographic evidence, but there is oral reports of that occurring. But we'll take into account that the orca was trapped.
And probably hungry.
Probably real hungry. There's also some reports in the same year of an orca attacking a fishing boat off Long Island. In the 60s, not much, 70s, orcas damaged a wooden schooner. One bit a surfer.
Schooner.
Like a schooner is a boat, like one of them.
That's not the schooner I know, but it sounds like a good schooner.
It's a buoyant schooner. It's going to float heaps better than one filled with beer.
Fill it up with beer.
So yes, one attacked a schooner and damaged it. One bit a surfer. But as you can imagine, like a surfer, especially like sharks mistake surfers all the time. Oh, there's been a couple of things where one sank an Italian racing yacht, and they have been known to display aggressive behaviour towards boats. Not all the time. There's plenty of videos of people on stand-up paddle boards and the orca just kind of has a look at them and doesn't tip them off. So you have to kind of look at the reasons, and there's a lot of scientific evidence behind the reasoning of some of these attacks, which somebody else is going to do a much better job. I'm going to give you a list of resources for you to have a little check of. In 2010, the BBC had a crew that was filming Frozen Planet documentary. They were videoing seals. Fur seals. So the guy was on the beach with his camera filming this documentary, getting footage of the fur seals, and an orca launched out of the water onto the beach thinking he was a seal and tried to chomp him.
I like that you used the word tried there.
Tried.
She leaves the anticipation. The anticipation is killing me.
He did not chomp him. Was that because he got his little peekaboos out of the water and said, oh, no, that's a human. I'm not going to chomp him.
They got too many bones.
They've chomped lots of seals. He could have just thought he was a seal. You know, you've seen footage of the National Geographic people laying on the ice photographing penguins. Like, if you're in the water, I'm clearly Team Orca.
Clearly.
I don't think I'm going to convince you to go swimming with one. A few years ago, there was a group, and I think her name's Gladys. There was a couple of Gladyses, but there was a group of orcas that were attacking yachts off the coast of Spain and Portugal quite aggressively, like snapping the propellers and stuff off, which again, they do know that if you bite the tail off a seal, it can't get away. Is it a similar thing? They're very, very intelligent creatures. But if you're interested in this, I'm going to give you a book to go and have a look at after we do this part, which is captive orca attacks. Do I suggest that you get into a swimming pool with one at SeaWorld? No, I do not. That is not safe. A cranky orca who has been taken away from its pod and put in a swimming pool for people to poke at and watch and made to do tricks will literally rip your fucking head off. I promise you. Multiple attacks have occurred on trainers in marine parks, resulting in injuries and fatalities, particularly involving Tilikum, who was a captive orca involved in 3 deaths. Attacks involve pulling trainers underwater, dragging and biting with incidents at SeaWorld parks and other facilities. Attacks occurred during performances, rehearsals and interactions with trainers, resulting in injuries and fatalities. And instances of orcas exhibiting aggressive behaviour in captivity were also noted, raising concerns about the welfare of captive orcas. And I'm going to put a big part on that, the welfare of captive orcas and human safety.
SeaWorld Australia, Gold Coast?
No, Australia has never had an orca in captivity. On Netflix, there is a documentary called Blackfish, and it follows the life of Tilikum. and the moral controversy of keeping orcas in captivity and the results in risks for the animals' well-being and the human safety. So the minute I got home from Eden, I watched this documentary. And it was this documentary where I watched orcas, like actual footage of orcas hurting trainers, that I became Team Orca. So I think you should watch it.
Okay.
And then we can check back in.
What country is this? What's it?
A lot of
his
it's all over the place because it goes right into trade in whale meat, the way that they capture the orcas and how babies are removed from their mothers to be trained in places like SeaWorld. And it's all done under the guise of research, or we have an injured whale and we're going to take it. A lot of the whales in these places, where there are some that are injured, but an injured whale isn't going to perform. You need to have a baby whale and it has to be conditioned. I believe a lot of it is for research, and it is imperative that we do research orcas because their numbers have declined close to extinction. They're doing quite well again now that whaling isn't permitted, like commercial whaling isn't, but...
Right, so they don't have any predators anymore.
No, humans are their only predators. Yeah. So I would recommend watching Blackfish. You can watch it with Claire and Tom. I watched it with Charlie. He left about halfway through. He wasn't as enraged as I was.
I don't know if there would be many people as passionate about this, about anything, than you.
Okay, so these magnificent creatures boast impressive intellect with brains that rank second only to humans in size relative to body mass among marine mammals. But it's not just their brain power that is noteworthy. Orcas also exhibit highly intricate social behaviours. They form tight-knit family units called pods, displaying remarkable cooperation and communication skills within their groups. When it comes to hunting, they are nothing short of ingenious. Orcas employ various strategies depending on their prey, showcasing adaptability and the ability to innovate. For instance, they've been observed intentionally breaching themselves to catch seals. Orcas demonstrate self-awareness as evidenced by their recognition of themselves in mirrors, which obviously only happens in captivity. This blend of intelligence, social complexity, and adaptability highlights the importance of understanding and safeguarding these remarkable creatures. Adult males can grow up to 10 metres long and weigh as much as 10,000 kilos. Females are a bit smaller, reaching about 8.5 metres in length and weighing up to 7,500 kilos. The lifespan of a male orca is typically shorter than that of a female. On average, male orcas live around 30 to 50 years, although they can occasionally live longer, with some reaching up to 60 years in the wild. This contrasts with female orcas, who often live significantly longer, typically between 50 and 90 years, and sometimes even 100 years in rare cases.
That is a significant difference.
It is, because, girls rule. And it will play in a little bit to this story and the relationship here. I'll come back to it. I won't forward side quest. I'll come back to these facts a little bit later on. So if you are someone who would like to understand more about this, I would love to recommend a book called Killers in Eden. The book's by Danielle Clode, who is a zoologist and a science writer at Flinders University. They were a sailing family. She did high school, I think, remotely, and went into Eden, and she's seen the museum and the skeleton in the Museum of Old Tom, and as a child, and this just ignited a passion in her that she's followed her through her whole life. There's also a documentary on Vimeo by the same name, Killers in Eden, and it's by Greg McKee, who is just a whale enthusiast. Again, he went to this time, and when I say it's a museum, I'm not talking like a Sydney museum. It's like a little hall that's been converted and they've built onto it over the years. It's a really cute, lovely, there's beautiful views out to the water from there. It's not this huge interactive. It's an old school museum, but this place is incredible. And if it wasn't for people like Danielle and Greg McKee, who went into this place and had the exact same reaction as I did, I wouldn't have half the information I have today, because Greg McKee did this quite a few years before I went to this museum, and he put together interviews with elderly residents from Eden who were around in the time that the whaling station was still in operation. His documentary, there's a YouTube version that you can see that's got some shorter parts but different. And then I think it was someone from the ABC picked it up with him, and then they made like a proper documentary, which you can watch on Vimeo. They interview Alice Otten, who at the time was 103, and Elsie, who was George Davison's daughter. She was 100 years old at the time. There was Bill and Doug. Alice and Elsie are no longer with us, and they were people who lived there and witnessed it and had family members who were whalers. So the story that's about to come next, these are people like Greg who just went, I need to know more about this, and went and interviewed these people. This information would be lost now if it wasn't for people like him doing that. So
Thank you, Greg.
yeah, thanks, Greg. Because I walked away from that museum with the exact same feelings that he had. Like, I just desperately needed to know more. And he came through with the goods. So that worked really well in my favour. Between 1826 through to 1932, 3 generations of Davidsons worked on the shore-based whaling station. The whaling station was on the banks of Twofold Bay, but over towards Kaya Inlet. So if you are looking at Twofold Bay from the Pacific Ocean, the whaling station is like as far back in the left-hand corner as you can get. It's gorgeous with these like little beaches dotted around it. I can't imagine that during the times when they were processing whales there, it would have smelt real nice. Like, I think it would have been pretty rank, actually. But now, standing on the shores there, couldn't get a better spot.
You're good at imagery, Shannon.
Thanks. It would have been a bloodbath. There was a homestead, but the homestead burnt down. But the little, it was probably more of a manor house. Like, I think it was a bit fancier, the original house. But the little homestead is still there. A lot of the whalers, like the people employed with as crew, were local Yuin people. And I wonder how much that plays into the protection of the orcas, because humpback whales are a natural food source for orcas, but orcas will generally only take calves because a humpback whale is a lot bigger than an orca and they're hard to take down and they get injured. And the processing area and the homestead is on the side of Twofold Bay, and it's quite shallow in this part, but Twofold Bay is out closer to the ocean, quite a deep inlet. The whalers would live there. The Yuin people also had their own community in that area. There is actually pictures when you visit the whaling station of where their camp was set up just around the corner from the whaling station. So they lived really harmoniously together. They worked for the Davidsons under the exact same conditions as the white people were employed. So there was no, they weren't taking advantage of the Indigenous locals, which was very different to previous employers in the area. So I did read something there about George, it might have been in the museum, about George attending school there with some of the Aboriginal kids in the community, and that they were really good friends, and it was so different to what had come in the previous generations for the local Indigenous people to have this equal partnership with the Davidsons, which was really lovely. So the Yuin people had their little camp. The Davidsons had their little house. They had gardens there to grow vegetables and stuff. It was quite a way into Eden's township for them to gather supplies. So obviously fish would make up a big portion of their diet, along with some fruit trees and stuff. So they were fairly self-sufficient in that space. The orcas had always used Twofold Bay as a bit of a trap. The way geographically that it's situated, and I'm using my hands to explain a lot of this, so I'll try and do it with my words instead. It almost works like a funnel. So you're imagining the whales coming up from south, from Antarctica, and then they basically have to split once they hit Australia, and some go up the east coast and some go up the west coast. And geographically, like as they come around, that deep water at the beginning of Twofold Bay was inviting to them, and especially on the way back as well when they had calves and they needed places to rest. So the Davidsons were living there, the Yuin people were living there, and this relationship develops between the killer whales and the Davidsons. And we're going to talk a lot about Old Tom, who they say is the leader of this pod of orcas. We know that orcas live in family groups. The part that I mentioned before that could be a little bit controversial is the fact that all three generations of the Davidsons mention Old Tom as the leader. Now, orcas are identifiable to humans because of their fins. So the big fin that comes off their back, they're quite tall. The colours are different. The markings are different. They'll have damage and different things on them. They can be different shapes. So they had names for a lot of these orcas in the pod. Now, all three of the generations of the Davidsons talk about working with Old Tom. He was the most famous and the leader of this pod of orcas. Scientific research will tell you that orcas are matriarchal societies, so the leaders will be women. Also, that male orcas live significantly less than female. So there is a possibility that Old Tom could have been a girl. Maybe there's not because they've got the skeleton. I don't know. Because he couldn't possibly have been in charge of the pod for all three generations. That's just not scientifically possible. He might have been a juvenile for the older generations and then come through. But they all talk about Old Tom. He is the most significant. So this relationship develops, and you have to remember that George grew up as a kid in this space, watching his grandfather and his father work and hunt whales. Now, they didn't hunt orcas. They hunted baleen whales, which are plankton-eating whales. So humpbacks, blue whales, white whales. That's what they were after. But the orcas were also after the same thing. So this kind of relationship developed. And when you go and listen to the stories of these local people about what would happen in this relationship, like it is enough to blow your mind. So the Davidsons are living on the banks, and Old Tom, once they knew that there was a humpback coming through, would swim into the shallow water of Twofold Bay over to Kaya Inlet and slap his tail on the surface to get the whalers to notice that he was there. So he's like, hey guys, here I am, the hunt's on. Now, these people might be in church, the kids might be in school, they'll be doing jobs, and apparently the term was rusho. So once the orca had indicated that they had picked up and cornered a humpback whale, so while that one whale's in there letting the whalers know, the rest of the pod are out at sea, possibly 10 kilometres away, holding up this humpback. And they'll be biting it and diving underneath it and stressing it out and making it tired. Some even throw themselves over the humpback's blowhole to stop it, to try and suffocate it. They are incredibly sophisticated hunters. They might take chunks out of the side of it. But by the time the whalers are in the boat, and then Old Tom, who's out the front flapping his little flippers around saying, hey guys, come on, He would then lead the boat directly to where the rest of the pod had the whale held up.
Wow.
So by the time, now you have to remember, these guys are going out in rowboats. They did not use motorboats because they didn't want to scare the orcas. They used handheld harpoons. So they're not using like those old school Japanese whaling ships that we see with the big motorized harpoons on the front that, can take out 40 or 50 whales in a day. They would row or often be towed by the orca to where the rest had the humpback held up.
Towed?
Sometimes towed, yes. And there are stories of old Tom just with a fishing boat that had like an anchor overboard, picking up the anchor rope in his mouth and just towing the fisherman. Like he was a bit of a prankster.
Wow.
So, and you think they're a dolphin, and if you see dolphins at SeaWorld, they're playful, lovely creatures. You see them swim along the side of boats and jump in the wake and jump in the waves. They look like they're playful. We know that they're super intelligent. According to Danielle, the scientist that I was talking about before, she talks in her book about how they can have specific expertise in areas. So within a pod, one might be an expert whale hunter, or one might be an expert seal capturer, and then they pass those skills on to each other. It's like a whole proper little community. Like they're not just fish. Mm. So by the time the whalers get out to the humpback, who is now exhausted, terrified, trapped, half suffocated, almost drowning, hurt, there's blood in the water, it will float to the surface, and often the orcas would swim underneath it to prevent it from diving, because humpbacks can dive a lot deeper than orcas. So that is their one defense mechanism, and why they feel quite safe in Twofold Bay, because it's very, very deep. So they can outdive an orca. But if the orcas are swimming underneath it and every time it tries to dive, they're taking a chomp out of its face, it's not going to continue to. So they'll come to the surface and just lay still in the hope to recover and rest. And that's when the whaling boat would come in. Often George Davidson with his, I think they call it a harpoon or a lance, which is basically just a big spear. Apparently the Aboriginal men were quite good at this as well, and spear the whale. The whale would obviously bleed a lot. It'd thrash about. It'd try and dive. It'd try and swim away. The orcas helped in stopping it from diving, trying to keep it close. There's accounts of the orcas grabbing the rope that's attached to the harpoon in its mouth to stop it from swimming away, like swimming against it. It's incredible, the story of how they worked together to do this. And now comes the law of the tongue. So what they would do is they would tie an anchor to the whale, which would keep it in place, and they would leave. Go back to their thing, and the humpback whale would be out in the ocean, and then the orcas would pull it down, and they would take their part, their reward for this, which was the tongue and sometimes the lips. And this is why it's called the law of the tongue, because that was the only part that the orcas were interested in. It was their favourite, their drive-through Maccas. So there was a payoff. That was the bit that they wanted. Them themselves could not take down an adult whale. They could have a calf, but they weren't really interested in the blubber and the fat. They might take a chomp of it, like if they were super starving, but the tongue was the part that they were after. So Davidson and his crew would head back in. They'd get cleaned up. The orcas would do their job. They would go back out, hook the whale, which I think it took about 36 hours to rise back to the surface because it would start to decay and fill with air.
Delightful.
Yep. And then they would tow it back to the whaling station where they would process the blubber for making oil for lanterns and soap. And
Are you ready for questions?
yeah. Bang them on in.
What would stop someone else from going to get the whale in those 36 hours?
So in Twofold Bay, I think the majority of the time so Ben Boyd had like a whaling thing, and there was some other people who Alexander bought the boats from. So those whaling things had ceased. The thing with the Davidsons was that I still think there were people around who did it. They talk about the Davidsons' green boat and that they believe that the orcas were able to identify which boats were the Davidsons, and that the Davidsons had this really unique, lovely relationship with the local Indigenous people. The Indigenous people you could not harm an orca. It was just not done. You couldn't, it was their family. So the Davidsons never, ever hurt an orca. That doesn't mean that someone in a different whaling group hadn't maybe thought, oh yeah, we'll get extra blubber out of this. Let's stab one of these guys. Orcas are incredibly, incredibly smart. So they would often protect the catch. They could capsize a boat. But there was also, if there's only one or two people that are whaling in the area, you've got a catch out there. If you turn up at the whaling station, a couple of k's down the coast, and they've got a whale and you caught it, I don't know, maybe things are different now, like back then to what they are now, whether there was a silent agreement. But I think that the orcas played a big part in it. The Davidsons had more success than anybody else in that area, and it was because of this relationship with the orcas.
And I guess they would have put everyone else out of business because their strategy was so much better.
They could also hunt at night. Where Twofold Bay is, there's a headland where Boyd Tower is on the end of, I think it's called Green Point. And sort of down around those headlands there's another decent-sized bay, and I think that's where they believe that was the home of the orcas. The other thing is, when orcas hunt mammals, they're silent. So like the Yuin people would notice that the wattle was starting to flower, and they'd say, yep, this is it. Time's coming. The whales will be here soon. The orcas would know that it was about time for the humpbacks to start coming through, and they'd come in and sort of hang out in this bay area. And as the humpbacks come through, you've heard the whale songs that you hear under the water. While ever they were silent, they could hear them coming from kilometres away, and they'd be there ready to ambush them and push them straight into the giant funnel that was sitting around the headland.
Wow. Next question.
Yes.
Whaling's obviously illegal now. We don't like it. Mm-hmm. Where do you sit with, you talk about how amazing this is. Where do you sit with the whaling side of the story?
I believe that what they were doing here was sustainable. Do I love the idea of humans going out and putting harpoons into whales? No, I don't. Did I send you a message this morning telling you I was crying into my cup of tea?
You did?
Because
humans are shit, it said.
I think shit was the nicest version of the word. Times are different. We don't need resources from whales to survive now. Then they did. Do I ever want it to happen again? No. When orcas hunt, they will be silent. So they can hear the whales coming from a long way off and then push them in. So sometimes this would happen at night. If they got lost, because sometimes they get separated from the orca, it was pitch black dark, you couldn't see the shores, you had no way to know which way you were going, they would slap their oars on the surface of the water and old Tom would turn around and come back and get them again. And this is where the stories of him taking the rope in his mouth and dragging them out to sea to the rest of the pod come from.
This part of the story is so beautiful. I don't need the next part of the story.
We're just going to leave that. So we're going to talk a bit about the pod now, right? So we've got this whole thing. The other thing I want to add is, like, in the daytime when this happened, it was a whole town affair. There was a bell, it'd get rung, the kids had come out of school, they'd all be lining the shores of the bay watching this happen. So it wasn't just the whalers that had this relationship with this pod of orcas, it was the whole town. An orca pod can have up to 40 members. They're usually family groups. In the pod that was living in Twofold Bay, they have names and identifying markers. So there was Stranger, Jackson, Hookie, Humpy, Cooper, Typey, Big Ben, Young Ben, Kinsha, Jimmy, Sharky, Charlie Adgery, Breely, Albert, Youngster, Walker, Big Jack, Little Jack, Skinner, Montague, and Old Tom. This is some of the names of the most prominent ones and the ones that they could easily recognise and had names for. If you want to know more about them and when they were there, there's a great section on the website of the Killer Whale Museum at Eden, and you can go in and you'll see what periods of time and who tended to be the leader of the pod and how they worked together. So they've got a nice little time frame of that without me going into the intricacies of who was the boss when and what orca come from who.
Could they tell the gender of these? Because that sounded like a very masculine pod.
So I am not 100% sure how you tell the gender. Kinsha was definitely a female, but as you can see there, they were all very male names, and it was very likely that some of those boys were actually girls. I only know that Kinsha was a girl because of reading Danielle's book, and they talk about Kinsha being exceptionally skilled at throwing herself over the humpback whales and suffocating them.
What talent.
Such a cool chick. So for George and his little gang of orcas, working with the whales meant that instead of 7 or 8 boats that most whalers would need, with crews to run each one of those boats, he would only need one. When you go to Davidson Whaling Station, there's a lot of photos, and the same in the museum of these beautiful pristine waters with a whale carcass in, and some of the things that people used it for. There was, I can't remember what it is now, there was pictures of people used to pay to come and sit inside the whale carcass because they believed it was a cure for some kind of illness, and I can't remember what it is now.
I'll Google it, Shannon.
Okay.
It was believed that the heat and gases produced by the decomposing whale combined to create a sweatbox environment, relieving the pain of rheumatic disorders.
I watched you almost physically spew twice while you read that.
Well, once was, how do I say this word? But the rest was, this is disgusting.
The decomposing corpses. Is there a photo? There's a photo in the museum of like these people in their like real fancy clothes.
Oh my God, there is.
Yeah, that's the one. Can you imagine what that would smell like?
Look it up, but don't do it if you're driving. Wait till you stop. Or don't. It's. I mean, you can just go with.
It's a choice.
Shannon's done a good enough job with the imagery there.
This kind of stuff was brave work. They did name George Fearless George because they believed that he was quite courageous and invincible. But a lot of the hard work for these whalers was being done by the orcas. Let's be real about that. But it was dangerous. They were often heading out at night. Sea conditions were perilous at times. Weather, it was cold. They were on wooden boats. I want you to think about the size of a whale, and then I want you to think about the size. I'll try and get a picture of the boats that they were on. So there might be like 8 or 10 men in these boats. You can imagine being out there in your little wooden dinghy with your oars and no motor next to a 20,000 kilo animal that you've just popped a spear in, and then it starts thrashing around. It is dangerous. The tails would smash the boats. The boats would capsize. People would get tipped out of the boats. Often when the lance or the harpoon would have a rope attached to it, and once it had been stabbed, the whale would try and run. And if you were the person in this boat and that rope wrapped around your leg, you would be pulled overboard and dragged under the water as the whale tried to get away. Like it was super dangerous work. But the orcas, if they saw this or people were knocked down, like if the boat capsized, and so you can imagine you're getting tipped out of a boat where a 20,000 kilo mammal is bleeding into the water and you're in the ocean. Can you imagine the sharks and stuff? Like,
oh, goodness, I hadn't.
Here we are. We're introducing the sharks. But the orcas would then switch, because orcas will just take down a shark. Like, no problem. The orcas would then surround the boat where the men had been tipped over and protect and stop any sharks coming towards the men until they were able to get to safety. There was stories of people starting to drown and sinking, and the orcas swimming underneath and pushing them back to the surface so they could breathe again. And I was like, okay, like, are we getting to Noah's story? You know, I'm starting to think here that, okay, because there's like stories of like the whales coming in and blowing through conch shells too. Like you got to try and, is it conch or conch? Conch shells? You know, there's big twirly ones that like you see in Moana and stuff. The woo! Whales don't have arms. We know that didn't happen. Like their flippers are cool, but they're not going to hold a shell. So, when I heard the story about them, you know, this sinking sailor and them pushing him back towards the surface, I was like, oh, okay, yep. This might be one of those things that sits in the maybe make-believe category. But this happens all the time, apparently, with mammals, with marine mammals. Dolphins do it and have been known to do it, and there's massive amounts of evidence. And they'll do it for other marine mammals and humans.
Wow. Makes you love them more, doesn't it?
It does. They're the coolest.
Yeah.
There was a lot of trust. It was also dangerous work for the orcas because they could get wrapped in anchor ropes and they could get hurt by the big humpback whale. I'm flapping my hands around like I've got whale fins. Nobody can see me. So
you should have seen a conch shell.
No one wants to see my conch shell. So they would get wrapped. Oh, God, it's going to take a minute to recover. The orcas would get wrapped in the ropes and stuff sometimes, and then they would come to the surface so that the whalers could unravel them from around their thing. So there was this really amazing level of trust and reliance on each other that developed between the whalers and the orcas. Oh, there's also the story about Jack. Jack well, I think he was a whaler and he lived there with his family, and they were just out on a boat. Like, I don't know whether it was evening and their boat, he was with his family and the boat got hit by a freak wave. They weren't whaling or anything at the time. And he was there with his kids and his wife, and the baby was knocked out of the wife's arms and dragged overboard, and the boat ended up capsizing. I believe the wife survived and they found the baby and the little boy's body the next day, but Jack's body wasn't recovered.
Way to bring the mood down.
Sorry about that. So over the next week or two, like these people were community, they looked for Jack. There was no hope. And over the next week or so, old Tom come in to the bay every day and he'd like swim around this area, and they thought that because orcas will mourn a loss in their pod, and so they were a bit like, maybe they know that Jack's died, and old Tom was sort of circling around this same area. And after it's happened for a few days or a week or whatever, they went out and searched this area and they found Jack's body exactly where old Tom had been circling. So on the day of the funeral, when they were transporting Jack from the whaling station into Eden, he was in a motorised boat, and the orcas would generally not swim alongside motorised boats. They were too noisy. It wasn't their thing. And that's why the Davidsons had success, because they used boats without motors. But the day that they transported Jack into Eden for his funeral, old Tom swam beside the boat like a guard of honour until they got the body back to Eden.
Wow.
Yeah. While I've got the mood a bit low, well, actually, it doesn't really come up from here. In early 1900s, I think there's some accounts of it being 1900, 1901, 1902. Jackson, who was one of the pod of orcas, was chasing a minke whale to force it to breach. Again, I think we've mentioned it before, common hunting technique with seals and small whales, that they would force them onto the beach. They would beach themselves, grab the prey, and then flip their way back into the water. But on this occasion, Jackson actually got himself beached as bro. Like, he was out the water and couldn't get back. George and his men must have been out and they witnessed this happen. So they started heading towards Jackson to help roll him back into the water. And as they did, a man appeared from the bush behind the beach and stabbed both Jackson and the minke whale. You can imagine what George felt witnessing that, but also the Indigenous men who were on board his boat. It was not great. So he stabbed both whales, and this man's name was Harry Silks, they found out later, and there was money to be made. So he thought maybe he could take the teeth, maybe, or I don't know what he thought was going to happen or what he was going to do with these whales, but he stabbed the both of them clearly, probably thinking he'd make money. So George and his crew witnessed this and they headed there as soon as possible. The whales died. There was uproar. Like, not just like the Indigenous community were just furious. It was as if this man had murdered one of their significant family members. And the white community were, pretty hot on their trail as well. Like, nobody was happy that this had happened. And it was lucky for Harry that the police caught up with him first. And they said, if you don't leave town, we're not going to protect you. We're going to let everybody loose on you. So he left and he never returned. But it made a big impact on the town. It made a big impact on the Indigenous people, because this was a white man who had murdered. And I don't know if he was a local or if he was just some dude who'd wandered in from out of town, if he was someone who had history with the whaling group and the Indigenous people. He may not have understood the significance of what he was doing, but it caused quite a few problems. So it wasn't long after Jackson was killed that the Aboriginal community in the area packed up and headed towards Wallaga Lake. I don't know if this was the only factor, but it did play a role in the decision making. Whale numbers were declining, and we'll learn a little bit more about that very soon, but by this stage there were much bigger commercial whaling crews that were whaling offshore, and this is where some of this problematic stuff happens. So food sources were slowing down, commercial fishing, and the ability to be able to process blubber on a ship, which meant that the whaling ships could stay out at sea for quite a significant amount of time. Yeah, the commercial whaling was making a big difference to these tiny little offshore projects. What would you call it? Offshore businesses. So it was around that time that the Aboriginal community packed up and left the area and headed towards Wallaga Lakes. The town will tell you that it was the murder of Jackson that made that happen. The orcas also stopped coming in the numbers that they were coming. And the town will tell you that it is the murder of Jackson that caused that too. But the reality of the situation is, and I'm not discounting that for either of those things being significant factors, but the commercial whaling operations had also upped the ante. There was offshore whaling, there was offshore fishing. This was impacting the food sources for local people with fish numbers, food sources for the whales themselves, and the number of whales. We're talking about a small whaling business that might catch 20 whales a year compared to a commercial fishing operation, which not probably at this time, but not too far after, at the height of whaling, they might take 10,000 whales in a year. Like, it's when you asked me before about how does it make me feel, there's a big difference between those two aspects of the same thing. There was a lot at play around the time. Obviously, the Depression come in to it, but there was probably also, with the war, petroleum-based products and things like that that were coming into the industrial side of things. So the call for whale oil probably wasn't as high either, which would drive the price down. So it was a dying industry, and unfortunately, these guys bore the brunt of that. The whales were still, the orcas were still seen around, and the humpbacks were still seen around, but the humpbacks were definitely dwindling in numbers. On the 17th of September in 1930, Old Tom made his last appearance in Twofold Bay. His dead body was found floating in the water in the same space where he would smack his tail on the water's surface to alert the whalers that the hunt was on. George towed his body to the mouth of the Kaya River, where he released the contents of Tom's stomach, which was virtually empty. Then, at the Try Works, George and his son carefully, lovingly cleaned and repaired and then mounted his skeleton for public exhibition. And that ended the relationship between the humans and the orcas in Twofold Bay, but started the beginning of the Eden Museum and the collection of the history of the area. And the history is so rich, from the Yuin people to Benjamin Boyd, the problematic practices that he employed, the next generation of people that came through, like the Davidsons, who were the exact opposite of the people who were conducting business in the area previous. And up until the early 2000s, the children of these whalers and the grandchildren of these whalers were still living in Eden, and they were sharing their stories. And so they took this information and oral history and have made this incredible space where me, who knew nothing about orcas outside of, what's the one with the one in captivity? The real famous one. Like when we were kids. And he jumps over the fence. What was that orca's name?
Free Willy?
Free Willy! That was as much as I knew about orcas. I turned up in Eden super excited to see humpback whales and came away with this intense desire to know as much as I possibly could about this animal, and have devoured everything I could get my hands on since. So if you're even remotely interested, those shows, the Killers in Eden on Vimeo, is an amazing documentary with the oral histories of people who were there and witnessed this stuff. The book by Danielle Clode, which is also called Killers in Eden. And if you want to understand about orcas and their personalities and their family relationships, I highly recommend that you watch Blackfish on Netflix. Thank you for joining us for today's episode of If These Trees Could Talk. If you would like access to more information about the places or information included in today's episode, please visit our website ifthesetreescouldtalk.com.au. If These Trees Could Talk creative writer is Shannon Walters, and it is produced at Bellevue Studio in the Hunter Valley with audio production by Megan Anderson. We would love to hear your feedback, so please rate and review, and if you would like to hear more, please subscribe. We look forward to joining you for our next adventure.